everybody. My name is Sophie Gresswell. If you don't know me already, I'm an artist based in Luton, and I've been working nationally for a couple of years now. So welcome everybody. This is a project called Ancestors Protect Me, and it is based on a thought that I had early in 2020 when COVID started and we sort of entered lockdown and we were stuck in our own places in our own heads. So I had the thought, if I could find the masks of my ancestors, perhaps they would protect me. And it was a raw response to many things, like we said, COVID, lockdown, the tragic death of George Floyd, and also the subsequent focus on the Black Lives Matter movement, which at the same time collided with me becoming aware of my own heritage and history, and a mass unmarked burial site of, as they were called, liberated Africans on the island of St Helena, the British Overseas Territory of St Helena, which is where my grandpa was born, which made me question my heritage and history. So that will be for another time and another talk. But this stimulated the project Ancestors Protect Me, and made me want to ask other individuals how the events of 2020 and everything that's gone on has affected them and their work and the responses locally, nationally and globally. So that's why I have some lovely guests with me tonight, who I will let Shemiza introduce a bit later. So as I said, this is talk 1 of 3 talks tonight, and then there'll be one on Wednesday night, 7:30 to 8:45, with artist and art therapist Miriam Grillo and theatre maker and performer Afia Campbell. And then there'll be another talk on Thursday evening from 7:30 p.m, which will be my sharing of work in progress around St Helena and my discoveries this year, which will have activist Peggy King George, who was a key woman in getting the New York Memorial put up for slavery and enslaved peoples. And also it will have filmmakers Joseph Corrin and Dominic Dever, who have done some work on St Helena Island. So without any more further ado of me going on tonight, I'm going to slip my camera off and let these lovely ladies talk. So we have tonight the wonderful Hannah Lavery, who's a poet and writer based in Scotland, and locally based Sidney Belony, who's another writer and theatre director who's done some wonderful work. So I will let the host tonight, the wonderful Shemiza Rashid, award-winning community broadcaster, radio producer and theatre maker and activist, introduce herself and introduce everyone else and let the chat begin. I'll be back a bit later for Q&A. So
thank you, Sophie, for that wonderful introduction, and massive big applause to you for the amazing work that you're doing and actually making this event happen. It's an absolute pleasure to be in the company of such powerhouse women this evening who are really trailblazing their work through the means of theatre making and poetry, to not just local audiences but international audiences as well. And it's for me, it's really, really humbling to be in their presence today. So this event is all about celebrating the creativity of these dynamic women, but also raising awareness of what heritage and race means to us, and especially in these testing times. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the absolutely wonderful ladies that are joining us this evening. And please be aware, as Sophie has said, that there is a Q&A at the end of the session. So if there's any questions that you want to ask them, please feel free to get them ready and we will read them out. Now, today we're joined by no other than the amazing Hannah Lavery. As Sophie has mentioned, Hannah is an award-winning poet, playwright, and she's based in Scotland. She's a performer, an experienced workshop facilitator. Her poetry and writings have been published widely, including You're No Mine was selected by Roseanne Watt as one of the best Scottish poems for 2019. The Drift, her autobiographical play, toured Scotland as part of the National Theatre of Scotland season 2019. she was awarded a New Playwright Award from Playwright Studio Scotland and named in the List magazine's Scottish Theatre Hot List for 2019. In 2020, she was named as one on BBC Writers' Room Scottish Voices and selected by Owen Shears as one of his 10 writers asking questions that will shape our future for the International Literature Showcase, a project from the National Writing Centre and the British Council. Hannah is one of Imaginate's accelerator artists and an associate artist with the National Theatre of Scotland. In November 2020, her play Lament for Sheku Bayu was directed by Hannah in co-production with the Royal Lycombe Theatre, National Theatre Scotland and Edinburgh International Festival. She was also awarded with a Creative Edinburgh Leadership Award in 2020 for her work in establishing and running a writing group for writers of colour and providing mentorship and opportunities for members of the group. Wow, what an amazing, amazing credit to this wonderful, talented lady who's joining us this evening. Thank you so very much, Hannah, for joining us. I'm really quite in awe of your work. It's an absolute pleasure to have you as part of this series of talks. Thank you. That is a little bit about Hannah. We're going to move on to our local talent. Our local talent that is no other than Sidney Belony. Now, Sidney Belony is a writer and theatre director based in Luton. Sidney creates theatre which explores social and political themes. Her writing credits include The Records, which was at the Theatre Royal Stratford East in March 2018, Wakes at Bunker Theatre, February 2020. She was commissioned by Burn Bright, writing the short play Box of Bottles in August 2020. Sidney is currently part of Soho Theatre's Writers' Lab. Alongside writing, Sidney works as a director and facilitator. She enjoys working on community-focused projects, including devised performances. Sidney was an associate artist on People, Power, Passion, Luton's pilot year of culture. Sidney's theatrical credits include assistant director, Riot Act, Luton Town Hall in July 2019, and dramaturg at the Butterfly Effect at the Hat Factory Art Centre in December 2019. She has written a short play commissioned by Creative Blue Balls called The Records, and it's part of the Writers' Watch List at the Royal Stratford East. And Wakes, her other play, which co-headlined the Upsetters Takeover Festival in Bunker Theatre in February 2020. Now, coming back to Records, this play, short play, explores the themes of Black British history, unrepresented historical stories. And Wakes is about a play about grief, friendship, and experience of two young Black women after a sudden bereavement, and the lives of two best friends are changed forever. The play explores themes of police brutality, institutional racism, and its impact within communities. Wow. It's an absolute pleasure to have you join us today, ladies. I'm really enamored by the amazing work that you've done, which today will inspire not just me, but also our viewers as well. So thank you so very much for taking the time and being part of this amazing series that Sophie is organising, which is all about Ancestors Protect Me, art belonging, and what this year means to yourselves. To begin with, I just want to say thank you and welcome. Hannah, how are you this evening?
I'm okay. Yeah, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Yeah, no, I'm all right. How are you?
I'm very, very well. Even better at being part of this event and knowing that you're part of this wonderful lineup as our special guest, because I'm an absolute fan of the work that you have produced and created and you're continuing to produce. So thank you. And you're joining us all the way from Scotland today.
All the way from Dunbar. So yeah.
How absolutely awesome. Sidney, thank you so very much for joining us as well, but you're a little bit closer to us, aren't you? You're local to us, to Luton.
Yeah, a little bit closer. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to kind of chat to everyone. I'm excited to share the stage with Hannah as well. I think what a wonderful introduction as well, hearing all of Hannah's credits, hearing my credits as well. So really lovely introduction. Thanks, Shemiza.
I'm buzzing. I'm totally buzzing. I'm sure our viewers will be as well, because it's an absolute honour to have you both here to talk about and share your experiences about this around this very, very poignant topic. But to begin with, I just want to ask Hannah, we're talking about heritage here. The first theme we're discussing is history, heritage, and belonging. So I wanted to ask you, do you think your heritage and your experiences have influenced the work that you've created? And it's a lot of work that you've created.
Well, I think, yeah, well, I suppose the answer would be very much so. I always feel like my work is very sort of preoccupied with the ideas of belonging and not belonging. So yeah, no, the answer would be yes. I mean, I think my first kind of real piece of work that I took out as a piece of theatre was called The Drift, and that was exactly about that. It was about the death of my father, and it was about kind of what Scottishness means. It was exploring the ideas of Scottish exceptionalism and Scotland's role in in transatlantic slavery and colonialism. So I think it has had a huge effect on my work, and it's something that I'm kind of, you know, I find myself exploring even when I don't mean to. So so yeah, so the answer is yes to that. Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it doesn't, yeah, no, I think the idea of belonging, whatever that comes, whether that's been particularly about race or being that specific, but I think there's always that theme of what it is to belong or not belong.
Your poem, Scotland, You're No Mine, was selected by Roseanne Watt as one of the best Scottish poems for 2019. What was it about that poem that got you acknowledged for being the best Scottish poem?
Well, I don't know. I suppose that's really, I don't, you know, whatever Roseanne Watt saw in it. But I think for me it was, I mean, that poem I've always described as a love poem, but it's, you know, it's quite angry, I suppose, in that sense that, you know, living in Scotland, there's a very particular, you know, Scotland likes to think of itself as a very tolerant and liberal democracy, and usually very much so in kind of, you know, and it has a very high kind of opinion of itself. We have this idea that a man's a man, which means that we're all the same and we're all equal, and it really roots our kind of identity as Scots. But then also there's an idea that Scottishness is seen as very much a whiteness. It's a forgetfulness about its kind of role in slavery and its role in colonialism, and Scotland's role, for example, in the transatlantic slavery was, for head of population, we're probably, I think we're the one country in Europe that made the most money from it.
Oh, wow.
More than England, more than, you know, we made so much money from it. We were so involved in it, but yet we like to talk about ourselves as being colonized, which is nonsense, because we were such huge we were hugely involved in colonialism, and we were hugely benefited from it. So that poem is really about the idea that Scottishness fails to recognize my history, but also the history of people of color, and also its own involvement, but also a kind of love story to the idea of Scotland having this potential to be this incredibly liberal, tolerant, open society, very much in contrast to, say, the politics of kind of Brexit and the rest of it, which we never voted for. So we have a different kind of attitude in some ways, but we also have this kind of ignorance around racism in this country and about our own kind of history. So that's what the poem was about. So yeah.
How did you feel when you put those words onto paper and that poem then got read out? Did people's opinions change in any way? Did you get to engage further conversation about the reality of Scotland's history?
Well, that poem was it was a piece of performance initially. So it was part of the Drift. So it was, yeah, very much kind of, it's a kind of poem that does ask for engagement and does ask for conversation. And then when my recent play, Lament for Shaker Bio, was looking at was looking at a lot of things, but one of the issues it was looking at was Scottish exceptionalism. And I think there's probably is an appetite in Scotland, a growing appetite to have these conversations. around the way in which we talk about our own history. And there's been, you know, obviously with the kind of resurgence, or not resurgence, but the way in which the Black Lives Matter has really entered in a sort of public consciousness. There's been a lot more conversations in Scotland around who we celebrate. So yeah, I think that poem really was a provocation, and I think there has been people that have, you know, that have had discussions with me. Whether I'm changing anyone's mind, I don't know. I mean, we often sort of perform or speak into our own little kind of echo chamber, so I don't know if it's reaching beyond that, but it certainly has. People have had conversations with me, and I've also been quite shocked, I think, about the actual reality of growing up or living in Scotland when you're a person of colour, actually. And that's been quite a shock for a lot of people.
Thank you, Hannah. It's a poem that's definitely worth its weight, and delighted that it led onto The Drift, which was an autobiographical play toured around Scotland. Somebody who's also passionate about words is Sidney Belony, who's also with us this evening. Sidney, you're a writer and a theatre director as well, and somebody who is really doing exceptional work, and for somebody so young as well. Your credits are wonderful, Sidney. Really proud to, you know, say that you're a Luton girl. Well done you. I want to ask you the same question as I've asked Hannah. Do you think your heritage and your experience of influenced the work that you've created?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I was really like resonating a lot with what Hannah was saying, in that I think for me, heritage is kind of split into two in the way I kind of approach work, in the sense that obviously my own kind of heritage and wanting to explore my own kind of personal experience and their sort of backgrounds, but also I'm very historically minded. I did a degree in history. I was very always engaged by ideas of historical storytelling and ideas of heritage as an act of storytelling, and the creation of history being in many ways an act of storytelling, an act of how do we make sense of the world and how do we curate the narrative of history, and kind of digging into that as a sense of history being something that we are creating, and the stories that we're telling being the things that we are creating, not just kind of things that happen in certain orders, but the thing that we choose to tell stories in certain ways, or we choose to prioritize remembering certain things or remembering things in certain ways. So yeah, so the idea of heritage and the word heritage is definitely a through line through a lot of the work that I've been doing in a personal sense, and also in a kind of general historical sense, definitely.
Has that changed in any way with the present climate, and especially the greater focus on the Black Lives Matter movement?
I suppose I think we talked about this a little bit before, where it's kind of hard to say much about what has changed in this current climate, in the sense that I'm a theatre maker, and for the majority of the time that we've been having these conversations on a public scale, the theatres have been closed. So like the majority of this year, the theatres have been shut, and we've not been having those sorts of conversations that in the ways that we were having them, in the ways that we might want to have them as theatre makers. So yeah, in certain ways, it's kind of impossible to know. It's impossible to know, you know, plays that we've done before, how they might be received now. It's impossible to know where people are at in their conversations as a theatre maker in that kind of sense. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint an exact answer, which is not a great answer to your question, I know, but it's kind of hard to pinpoint how we might answer that question at this moment in time, I think.
But it doesn't stop you from putting pen to paper and creating.
No, but I think those are two separate things, where it's like where you are in processing the conversation and where you might think the conversation at large is. I think, yeah, I'm struggling to kind of I feel like if I'm you know, if I'm processing things in my sense, and knowing that my audiences are also processing these conversations, and that I don't have the medium that I would usually have to have that conversation with them, it's kind of impossible for me to accurately make any statement about where we're at in those conversations in any kind of meaningful way, I suppose, if that makes sense. It's a really poor answer to your question, but yeah.
No, it's not poor at all. I want to talk about the plays that you've written, Sidney. I wanted to talk about your experiences with writing Wakes, which was co-headlined at the Takeover Festival. And it was a play about grief, friendship, and experience of two young Black women after a sudden bereavement, and the lives of two best friends are changed forever. And And what were the themes that you were exploring in this particular play?
Yeah, so the kind of birth of the play was this idea of friendship between two young Black women, and the idea that a friendship could be changed by an experience of grief. That was kind of the central thing that I was thinking about. And then from there, thinking about kind of the ripple effect of, so we find out in the play that the grief in question is a grief that has occurred by police brutality. So thinking about the wider ripples of instances of brutality and the kind of community and human experiences of these instances. So kind of taking an instance and looking at it from the perspective of a younger sister and her best friend, and how are their lives changed? How is their friendship changed? How are their experiences changed by this thing that has happened in their vicinity, but not necessarily directly to them, if that makes sense? And kind of really looking at how weights of community grief and weights of kind of social movement and weights of justice, weights of injustice often fall upon young Black women, and how sometimes we don't have those conversations to really think about the wider ripples when we're having these conversations about injustice, when we're having these conversations about brutality, when we're having these conversations about structural institutional racism. We're not thinking about teenage girls sitting in a park. And so that's what I really wanted to do, is kind of draw those links between these conversations and say, actually, they're manifesting in people's everyday lives. They're manifesting in the ways that people do things or they don't do things because of these big questions, and kind of taking that down to kind of a human level. So that's what I was kind of trying to do it in that play, really.
So do you think that storytelling is the best way of educating people about these topics that are just not discussed openly enough?
I don't know if there is a best way. I think you will reach different people in different places, and I think the subject is so big that I think there is one singular best way that works for everyone. Certainly, it's a very effective way. Certainly, it's a very useful way, and of drawing these, sort of using storytelling to draw empathy, using storytelling to make things make sense to people, and to make conversations that might be quite dense in abstract senses, and presenting them on stage, and presenting them in human form, and allowing people the space to kind of meet issues that they might not necessarily meet in their everyday life in the space of a theatre and in the space of storytelling, certainly is very effective. I don't know, like I say, if it's the singular best way, because for some people it's really not, but I definitely think it's a very, very effective way.
Coming back to Hannah, what's intrigued me about your work is you began with poetry and then went into playwriting. Why did you feel you needed to move from one medium to another?
I don't think I really felt the need. I think it's just kind of I was writing poetry, and then I was writing kind of, I think, what people would describe as performance poetry or spoken word. And so it all sort of started to just become theatre. And I think I always argue that poetry has got a stronger place in theatre than anything else, to be honest. I mean, that's how theatre began. So I think, I was just thinking interesting about what you're saying there, Sidney, about narratives and storytelling. I mean, I would say it is the best way. I feel like we understand each other through narratives, and we understand each other, and we develop empathy. And I think that poetry and plays and theatre are a place, are kind of where we exercise and develop our empathy. So for me, moving from one medium to another didn't feel strange, because it felt like it had the same goal, or it had the same it was the same impulse, which was to reach and to have a conversation. And I mean, my theatre work is, especially the lament, which I've just done, is still really a poem. It's a kind of, it's within a lament form. But yeah, I think for me, it all felt very natural. I think I've never been one for labels. So for many reasons and in lots of different ways, but I just feel that people have labeled me a poet and people have labeled me a playwright, but I just keep doing, I'm just enjoying the work. And so yeah, I don't think I made a real conscious decision to move from one to another, and I'm still doing both. So but yeah, I think maybe it comes from that thing of really wanting to create work that asks people to exercise their empathy, and I think that, for me, that feels incredibly important, especially for the times we're living in. I feel like the more that we can hear each other's stories and the more that we can develop empathy, the better. And I think storytelling is the best way to do that. So I
Yeah, it's interesting as you. Sorry, I didn't want to cut off what you were saying.
Go.
No, I think it's interesting as well. I think broadening the idea of storytelling, just as you were kind of saying that, I think I was kind of thinking about like theatrical storytelling, but I think also we're storytelling in our everyday lives anyway. And this idea of like, yeah, like you're saying, telling people stories not necessarily being about theatre, like it might be about poetry, it might be. So I feel like I want to step back a little bit from what I had initially said, just in response to what you said, because yeah, I think certainly theatre might not necessarily be the best way for everybody, but the idea of storytelling in a more general sense, and the idea of storytelling being poetry and being all other senses, definitely, yeah, is an exercise in empathy for sure.
And also having the control of your own narrative and sharing your narrative to a wider audience, and having that control is a beautiful thing, no? Yeah,
no, absolutely. Well, for me, it has been, I think, starting when I've started to direct as well, I feel like that's been really important to take your, that the thing of having that vision and then just taking that right through to the end has been really, really incredible. But yeah, I think there is, I think a lot of the experience of being on the outside or being a person of color, a lot of it is about having stories told at you or not having agency within your own, within your place in history. We just seem to live in the footnotes. So actually taking your own, like literally taking center stage and saying, this is the story and this is the way it should be told. And actually I'm going to be at the center of this and not at the edge of it, or not at the, so yeah, I think there's an incredible, it's really liberating and really important. So I've forgotten the question. I'm really sorry.
No, but you've answered it beautifully. And so thank you so very much. It's about that ownership of your own story and being center stage and not having it being told at you. I think is a real testament to your work, Hannah, and also to your work as well, Sidney, because your work is not just about yourself and sharing your heritage and your history, but it's also working with the wider community and other writers as well, which we're going to be talking about later on in the discussion. I want to come back to Sidney and just ask Sidney, where do you fit best, Sidney, as a writer or a director?
As a writer, but if anyone's watching this thinking they want to hire me as a director. Yeah, no, as I would say, first and foremost, I approach work definitely from kind of written text, or from kind of collecting thoughts in a written sense, whether that's in a devised way of kind of collecting pieces of thoughts and collating them together, or whether it's in a way of literally sitting there and writing a script. But definitely my first impulse is as a writer, definitely.
I wanted to ask you about your experiences on working on People, Power and Passion, which was quite an ambitious project created in Luton as part of Luton's pilot year of culture. How was that for you? I mean, the play was called Riot Act. Did you get to riot?
A little bit. There was a little bit of a controlled rioting, but no, because for anyone who doesn't know, People, Power, Passion was the Luton Council's pilot year of culture in 2019. It was kind of all built around five months of kind of arts activity in Luton, based around commemorating a series of not a series, but like a riot that happened in 1919 and the burning down of Luton Town Hall. So it's kind of based around the historical story of that, and using that to work with communities and explore issues from the kind of original story from 1919, but dragging that to 2019 and saying, what is Luton today? How can we bridge those kind of historical gaps? And also, how can we celebrate who we are as a separate thing from that historical kind of jumping point? So Riot Act, we were creating a play on that took place on the actual week of the 100-year anniversary, and we were kind of telling the story of the riot and how it happened and how the original town hall got burnt down, but we were also exploring ideas of exclusion, social exclusion, and ways that people feel within communities and outside of communities in Luton. And I'm forgetting the question as I'm describing the play, but no, it was a really interesting project, because I think thinking about this idea of heritage, we were working on what was kind of in many ways a heritage project, pulling these ideas from 100 years ago to today, but a heritage based around place. And we were finding when we were going into communities, we were working with communities that, yes, were Luton communities, but often people who didn't have in their own personal heritage any connection to 1919 in Luton. And so trying to pull those ideas of how can we draw our heritage in Luton today from a community that doesn't look like the community we have here today and doesn't feel like the community maybe that we feel like we have today, and kind of looking at, okay, themes of exclusion being unfortunately quite historically universal, themes of inequality and injustice being again unfortunately quite historically universal, and like pulling those ideas and thinking about how can we empathize in other ways. So not just kind of through a kind of personal heritage, but through I live in a place and I have a belonging in this place, and I can ground that belonging in my own validity as a person in 2019 Luton, and also in my understanding of how my experience might relate to people who have also been here, and that I inherit heritage from where I am and from where I exist in my community, not just from maybe my parents' heritage or from my family heritage. And looking at it from that sense was an interesting experience for me, certainly, as someone who had kind of looked at heritage in that more sense that we've kind of talked about as this kind of inherited through family and through community, but also exploring this idea of the heritage of the places where we are, being quite interesting.
And also,
yeah,
I'm being taught heritage through curriculum.
Yeah.
The way we've been taught, which has been at times not very accurate. So for somebody who's actually studied a degree in history, did you ever question what you were being taught and what you were learning?
Yeah, I think certainly. It's funny. So the play that we talked about, The Records, and when I got the commission for that, it was something, I can't remember the exact wording, but it was something like a social issue that really bothers you. And me being me, I was like, I really want to talk about how racist a lot of academic history is. And so that was just something that I really sat on my brain and sat on my mind from doing that degree. And what I did in that play, what I was trying to do in that play, is to really kind of dig into this idea of history being the creation of a conversation between us as contemporary people and historical sources, and really like think about the way that we use sources, or the sources that we use, and the stories that we tell and the people that we prioritize. And that being a kind of created thing, that doesn't just happen by kind of like force of nature, that we choose to study certain things, or we choose to tell our children about this guy that did this, and we choose not to tell our children about this guy that did this, and that being a conscious act that we're consciously doing. So that was what kind of triggered me really to write that play, The Records. And like I say, it was kind of using that kind of magical realism sense, where I had a character that was literally the physical embodiment of 200-year-old papers, and they had this physical conversation of, you don't speak to me, or you don't listen to what I say, you don't acknowledge me properly, you don't study me properly. And that kind of conversation being a two-way conversation, and not the kind of force of nature that I think sometimes people like to say, where it's just kind of, oh, we have to study this guy because he's really important. Not, well, why do we think he's important? Why do we think this event is important, and we think that's more important than this event over here? And what does that say about where our priorities are in our society, and what does that say about what our kind of focus is, if that makes sense?
Can I then ask you, do you feel that because you have these skill sets, and because you have the confidence and the fact that people are commissioning you to work, to create these plays, to write, to direct, that you have got a greater responsibility now to make sure that you showcase the correct story?
I definitely think that there's a responsibility. I think the responsibility isn't necessarily in historical accuracy always, in the sense that I think sometimes it can be more useful to interrogate the idea of why we think something is important more than it is in being accurate in this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. But I definitely think that there is absolutely a responsibility in there, but I think it would vary against what the project is. So thinking about like when we did Riot Act, yes, it was important to tell the story, but is it more important to make sure that we're drawing out these connections to the community now, rather than creating something that is, okay, yeah, perfectly historically accurate, but it means nothing to the community in Luton today? And so I think that's where the kind of responsibility lies in kind of, yeah, there definitely is a responsibility, but I think it varies on the project and on the focus of the project and what you want the project to be and what you want it to mean.
And to have a kick-ass director like Sidney, yeah? To make it happen. That's what we want to see, right? Coming back to Hannah. Hannah, you're listening in to this wonderful young lady, Sidney, who's an emerging but successful theatre maker. When you look at somebody like Sidney, how does it make you feel as somebody who has a bit more experience?
I'm not sure I've got that much more experience than you, Sidney, really, but yeah, no, it's great to see that. I'm just loving listening to what Sidney's up to and how she's kind of approaching things. It sounds really exciting. I think that there's I just think, yeah, I find this year really difficult because it felt that there were so many really exciting things happening. I think my fear for theatre is that a lot of the kind of emerging artists and the people that are, will find it that when we come back to theatre, whether those spaces will become more limited. And my hope is that actually what we've learned is that there kind of through the lockdown is an appetite for more stories rather than kind of a return to some sort of kind of nostalgic popular work, which is often read as white men. So I'm really hoping, so it's lovely to hear what you're up to. I'm always inspired by hearing people who are making theatre. I think it's I'm going to go and try and find if I could find ways to watch this work or read it. So wonderfully inspiring.
And this is what this event's all about, is about making sure we're creating these connections and making everybody aware about the amazing work that you're doing, Hannah, and also the amazing work that Sidney is doing. I want to ask you, as Black women in the theatre industry, are there enough spaces for you to project your work and get it showcased and for it to be taken seriously? Shall we start with Hannah, please?
Okay. It's difficult. I mean, I in a lot of ways I've had a lot of opportunities to kind of get my work out there recently. But then I'm also very conscious that I'm kind of light-skinned mixed race women. So and I think that when we talk about artists of color, there's a kind of we have to kind of acknowledge if you have privilege, and I certainly do have an element of privilege that English is my first language. I have a British passport. I think it's a lot more difficult for other artists of color and other female artists of color who don't necessarily have those same privileges. I think that there seems to be a real appetite at the moment to create more space. And that's been a lot of obviously a kind of reaction to the impact of Black Lives Matter this year. Whether that will continue and whether those promises and those will be will be kept is another question, really. And I worry that this new kind of period of recession and financial difficulty will mean that those kind of promises to open up spaces and will be that'll be an excuse to kind of stop that work. So some days I feel quite hopeful about it. Hopefully that there's, and especially listening to kind of Sidney talk about her work, that I'm hopeful that there will be this space and that people will see that there's an appetite for this work. But I do worry that now as we move into a kind of, a period of this obviously going to be quite a deep recession with kind of Brexit and COVID, whether those spaces will, as they become more limited, that they will shut people out who don't fit a kind of an idea of what success is or what successful work is. So I think we're in a real period of flux at the moment. I don't know how it's going to pan out, if I'm honest. I don't know how you think, Sidney.
Yeah, I think really, really similar. I think, I also think it's really important to acknowledge, as you say, when we're talking about experiences as Black women, also acknowledging areas where you do have privilege and areas where, there are certain aspects of the conversation that just aren't, I feel I'm just not for me to address. They're not for me to insert my voice into. I think it's really important to be aware of that as an artist and to say, yes, there are conversations that I can express as a Black woman and there are ways I can contribute as a Black woman, but also there are conversations that are just not for me. And that being a completely valid and also the most helpful way to approach these conversations. And I'm completely in agreement with Hannah. I think there's a sense of, I feel like broadly optimistic. I don't think there's any other way that you can kind of approach it. That I think if you're sat here saying, we're never going to work again, it's not a great talk. So I think, so it's definitely having that sense of optimism and also a sense of worry. I think especially recently, I've been thinking a lot about kind of Brexit and this idea of the story of the nation and the idea of who is British and what is the story of how we are going to conceptualize ourselves as the nation and what is the place of the arts within that. And you know, thinking about things like the UK Fest or like the Festival of Britain, or I don't know what they're calling it now. But yeah, that's a kind of idea of art being a part of that construction, but who is allowed at the table, or who is allowed to be part of that construction, and what is the kind of storytelling within that. I think there are definitely areas within that are concerning to me. But I don't know if I have enough of a kind of formulated idea of it, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like these are all things that are kind of up in the air of like concern, but broadly optimistic. It's probably where I am.
Sidney, what would you like to see more of in order to see more equality in the theatre arts world?
I think it is about like how we've kind of talked about this idea of ownership of stories, and this sense that stories are wanted because they are important, not that they're wanted because they look good, because we're fitting certain agendas, or oh, it works for us to have you because, you know, for I don't know, for a funding reason, or for the aesthetic of having, oh, we've got, you know, a Black woman story, or we've got, you know, whatever, you know, the kind of sense that things are being used in a aesthetic way. I think moving away from that. And so this idea that stories are valid because they are valid, and that there's not this kind of, oh, they're valid because we're having to justify this reason, or we're having to serve whatever kind of agenda. This idea that all of us are valid story makers, and that we all have a place, and we're not just there to fit certain kind of boxes. I think sometimes that there still can be that sense at certain points. And I think also I would love to see a movement away from kind of focusing on, not too much, but kind of focusing on like the identity of the creator, but that only being the case when they are marginalized creators. So this idea that like, oh, if you're a Black woman, you create a certain type of theatre, and that just being nonsense. Or like the idea that people get asked to come in and talk, but only from the perspective as a Black woman writer, not as a like, well, just as a writer, or like just like that kind of sense of work being grounded in community and grounded in people's experience, but that not being a requirement, that you can be any kind of theatre maker and a completely valid theatre maker, that you're not having to kind of justify yourself at every single given point. That this idea that everybody has ownership of the thing, and that you're not being invited in because you're an essential part of the thing, regardless of your identity and background and all these other things that are obviously at play in your perspective, but that being a kind of essential and integral thing.
Yeah, there definitely seems, sorry to come in, but there's definitely, to me, it feels like, you know, as an artist of colour, you're often asked to be a politician as well, and not just, and that can be quite exhausting and quite difficult. And also that your work is always seen as representative of all work, you know, and what do I mean by that? I mean like, you know, you put a piece of work on, and people are going, oh, well, you know, why that story? Why not another story of colour? And it's like, well, no one says that about a white person's piece of work. They go, why have we told that white story? There's 5 other white stories that we should have told that were more important than that white story. It's like, just wouldn't happen. So I think you're right. I think the idea of being less politicians, more the artist, and more being able to speak as an artist, and to be able to say whatever it is we want to say, and not have to be representative. And I feel that there's so many different kind of mediums have allowed people to be all of the human that they are. But it feels like theatre is still sort of saying, you know, and then that thing about, oh, we want to, you know, you bring you in, you will bring a brown audience in. It's like, well, not necessarily. Like, I'll just bring an audience in. I'm not.
I like theatre and like stories.
Yeah, she only brought 2 brown people in, you know, and they were related to her. So she's not.
How could you do that? How could you do that? Now we're talking about theatre. I think our audience would love to see a trailer of your work, and we do have a piece of work by Hannah Lavery today. I'm really delighted to showcase her Lament for Sheku Bayou, which we're going to be sharing with you on the screen right now. This work has been directed by Hannah in co-production with the Royal Lycombe Theatre and National Theatre of Scotland.
My beautiful brown boy, welcome to your world. Let me tell you that the monsters are not under your bed.
And this is not a new story. It's an old one. What should I do then?
I don't know, you could start by listening. I'm just a voice, saying your name and asking others to do the same. Sheku.
tell us a little bit about this work that you've created here, Lament for Sheku Bayo. I understand it came from a poem?
No, it was, no, no, Sheku Bayo was a young man, 31, who died in police custody in Kirkcaldy in 2015. And I was commissioned by the Lyceum to create a lament. So to create, and the lament is a very Scottish form, a very Gaelic form, and to really create a piece of work that was very poetic, but it was about grief, and it was about mourning Sheku Bayo. So it was not an investigation of, though the play did challenge the kind of narratives that grew up around Sheku Bayo and his death, which were, you know, full of racial stereotyping, full of, you know, real kind of institutional kind of racism. But it was about a mourning, and it was about, I think someone sent me an article recently by the New Yorker, which talked about Black deaths, or being the unmournable body. And I think it was really about creating a kind of a piece of mourning, and actually by rooting it in that Scottish tradition of keening and lamenting, it was also saying that this story was a Scottish story. And I think it's very, Sheku Bayo was talked about as being the other, as being this, like this unmournable, so different from the rest of us, you know, talked about as being like supersized, and all these kind of, you know, that they were very used to hearing about Black men, and especially when they die at the hands of the police. So it was really about rooting that story in Scotland and saying, this is a Scottish son, and this is our story, and he belongs to us. And so it was performed by 3 keeners, 3 Scottish Black women who performed the piece, and it was kind of full of music and full of poetry, and it really kind of challenged the kind of narratives that were going around, and offered a different thing, but also talked about how this death really grew out of our own racist society, and which we allow these myths to grow, and we allow these we allow racism to grow and to take root in our institutions. So it was about that as well.
Because you were commissioned to do this by I just wanted to clarify, by the Lyceum Theatre?
Lyceum. So it's the Royal Lyceum, and the artist director is David Gregg. So he commissioned it, and then the National Theatre of Scotland and the Edinburgh International Festival came on as partners.
Was this a turning point for theatre, do you believe, in actually sharing the reality of the lives of Black young men?
I think for Scottish theatre, it was very unusual to see a play from the National Theatre of Scotland with 4 Black Scottish women, and to have a, you know, a kind of predominantly Black creative team, and it was all female team as well behind it. So in terms of that, it was I think it was very different, and it felt like a bit of a moment. And I think telling the story of Sheku Bayo was really important, because we'd had, you know, in Scotland, that story most people didn't know about it. Most people didn't know about Sheku Bayo, didn't know what had happened to him. It wasn't, you know, and I think, you know, I wrote it before the death of George Floyd, but, you know, he died in a very similar way to George Floyd, and nobody in Scotland did anything about it. But yet, you know, so it was incredibly, I think, important for people like the National Theatre of Scotland to back that play and want that to be a significant kind of play for them for last year. So yeah, it's hard, isn't it, to say what's significant and what's important, but yeah, it was definitely in that rehearsal room. I mean, we as the cast, as the company, it was incredibly unusual for us to be in a rehearsal room in Scotland, in a room that was predominantly women of colour. I mean, it just never happened. I think one of us said, I've not been around this many Black people since my last family funeral. And it did feel like that, you know, it was quite a moment. Yeah, it was a moment.
a historical moment and may more continue to be like that. So how easy is it for you to break away from your personal versus like the political work or political themes in the storytelling and narrative that you write?
For me, I don't think one doesn't stop and the other doesn't begin. I think that, you know, I definitely think that the personal is political, and I think you know, and whatever, I think sometimes telling the story of family and as a person of color and just presenting family and love and normality can sometimes feel really radical when those are not the stories that are told about us. So, you know, I think particularly I feel most things feel quite political, and I think when I'm overtly political, it doesn't feel like much of a leap from, you know, from anything I do. So I don't really see, in some ways I don't see the difference. It always feels like it's coming from the same place.
Sydney, what about yourself? Is it easy for you to move away from the personal versus the political?
I think the same thing. I think it's definitely a continuum. I think there are points at which I think there's definitely a place in which things can be too personal to create work from at that exact point. I think certainly I'm thinking about Wakes, where like I thankfully have not been in the situation that the characters are in Wakes, but certainly the idea of grief and the idea of grief impacting friendship came from a very personal place for me. And that was something that I sat with for many, many months before I reached the point where I could think about it in a story structure and where I could start to analyze it from a political sense and start to dig into those political questions, because I had to be removed from that kind of personal experience in order for me to have that kind of sight. I think sometimes things can be so immediate that you need that step away from it. And also as a human person to experience things in your life and to cope and manage with things in your life as a separate thing from, okay, I'm an artist who wants to create political work. I think you need to have a space to manage that and to look after yourself within that work. I think sometimes can be a little bit overlooked, where it's like, I feel a really like a burning desire to talk about this, but also I'm not okay to do that at this point. I think is a really important thing to kind of, I definitely have gotten better at managing that in my own career. But yeah, so yeah, I think it's a continuum, but I think there are places where you kind of have to make sure you're looking after the personal as well as the political. I think, yeah, having that kind of balance as well.
Sydney, are there enough safe spaces for young people of colour to actually have these conversations?
I mean, maybe there are never enough spaces. Maybe until the world is the safe space, that, you know. So there is a part of me that wants to say that you know, until everywhere is safe, then there aren't enough safe spaces. So yeah, I think it's I think for as long as we don't have, for as long as there are places where people feel unsafe, there are not enough safe spaces. I think is my kind of initial instinct response to that.
And I want to kind of go now towards your community and grassroots work, because both of you wonderful ladies are not just only creating theatre for yourself, but you're inspiring and motivating and engaging with the wider community. Sidney, you've worked alongside the NGYT Writers Collective as part of a community project. And Hannah, you've established a Scottish writing network for writers of colour and Scottish BAME network as well. Going to Sidney first, why do you feel it's important to kind of work with the younger generation and sharing your ideas with them?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm sharing as many ideas with them as they are sharing with me, to be quite honest. Yeah, I think it's important in the sense that I don't think I do much other than hopefully allow them space and permission to say things that they already think and do things that they already can do. I think sometimes when we think about kind of like creating youth spaces, I think it's not kind of manufacturing something that isn't already there. I think young people are already having political ideas, they're already engaging with the world. It's just kind of saying, well, here's a space where you can do that. I think more so than kind of me, I don't think I'm doing anything over and above creating that space and allowing the floor for that. And I think, yeah, certainly they teach me more than I teach them for sure. But yeah, so yeah, I think that it's important that we have those spaces. I think sometimes when we think about kind of politics and thinking about these sorts of conversations, and oftentimes like abstract concepts of like justice or social justice and experiences of injustice, I think sometimes people can say, oh, like young people don't understand or they don't have the experience, and that's just simply not the case. And I think it's just providing that forum to say, actually, young people have experiences of the world, and yes, they might not be politically enfranchised, they might be under 18, they might not be members of, you know, certain organizations or institutions that give them other ways of kind of political engagement, but that they have valid viewpoints on the world that they see around them, and they are invested in the world that they are in. So I think that is kind of more, yeah, like I said, I don't think that I'm kind of doing anything particularly special in the group other than kind of acknowledging that fact as a reality in life, if that makes sense.
You're so humble, super humble. It's just, for young people, I think it's really important to have role models to look up to see that, you know, people of colour are making their mark. And for a young person to see somebody, a young person that can identify themselves in a mentor like yourself, Sidney, I think it does make a massive big difference. So I want to say thank you for everything that you are doing and you continue to do. Hannah, you've been awarded a Creative Edinburgh Leadership Award in 2020 for your work establishing and running a writing group for writers of colour and providing mentorship and opportunities for members of the group. How has that experience been for you, and what have you been able to kind of see happening?
Right. Oh, lots of things. I mean, I just to clarify, there's a Scottish BAME network, and I run a Writers of Colour group for that network. Mm-hmm. So at the beginning of lockdown, it went from being a monthly group where we met in Edinburgh to being a weekly group online. So we met every week from sort of kind of just before lockdown, and we're still meeting every week. And it's been incredibly important to all of us, actually, going through, first of all, the realization that COVID seemed to be kind of, we were more, as people of colour, were more vulnerable to COVID, it seemed, and our communities were, to then what happened after George Floyd, and so there was a lot of support that happened, and obviously we're all kind of experiencing our lockdown around that time. And I would be like the same as Sidney. I find mentoring and running and facilitating writing groups, which I've been doing kind of my whole career, incredibly rewarding and important to my own practice. And I kind of feel that it's at the core of what I do, and I don't see them as separate things. I think they feed each other. And this group's been incredibly important to me, and I've learned so much. And I think it's just incredible when you're around writers of colour, just the diversity of talent and the stories that are there to be told. And I always get really frustrated when people say there's not enough writers of colour, and I think, God, I meet like 25 of them every week, and they're all incredible. So yeah, I feel like mentoring and running groups like that, I just feel like every artist should do it, because it feeds your own practice and it really supports you as an artist, and I think it's really important.
Could I ask you, do you think your work will change in the future?
I hope so. Just like it would be, I quite like, yeah, I hope it changes and keeps moving, and yeah, I think it will. I don't know. Sidney, will yours change?
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing. I hope so. Yeah, I actually think I spend the next 30 years just writing the same thing. Yeah, I really hope it does.
I hope so too. Just one last question, and then I think we're going to be going to the Q&A, because we've got a lovely audience listening in to you fabulous women. Do you think your audiences and others approach, interpret and react to your work will change, do you think, in the future?
I'm going to get Sidney to answer that one. I have no idea. I don't know how they will be different. Hopefully more receptive, maybe. I think there's a kind of change in the audience and the stories they want. And I think that theatres are starting to realise that there's an appetite for our stories. So maybe that will be the change.
Fingers crossed. And what about you, Sidney?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've actually thought about quite a lot just over this kind of lockdown and the shutdown of the theatres, because I did Wakes at the end of February, and then 2 weeks later, the theatres were shut. And we were having these conversations about police brutality, institutional racism, how it impacts community. And then we kind of sat there in July and May, and those conversations were happening on the news. And so the scale of the conversation and the levels of engagement with those themes are happening with people that maybe weren't having those conversations at the point at which we did Wakes. So I think I've definitely thought a lot about, if we were to do that show again, where might it reach people, or where might people be at in their consideration of certain themes, or where might they feel about things that happen in the play, things that don't happen in the play. What might that interaction be? Because a lot more people have had those conversations, completely separate obviously from the work that we've been doing, but like I definitely think that, yeah, I've definitely thought a lot about like what that might mean for that show, just because, like I say, I did that show and then 2 weeks later the theatre shut. So yeah, I think it's something I've thought about a lot. I don't know, but I think it's definitely an interesting question for sure.
And 2020, what's been the revelation for you, Sidney?
I think I thought a lot about like scales of problems and scales of situations. I think there was a certain point at which, like, certainly with the coronavirus, where it was so big that you just couldn't think about it other than in the small. So because, like, if you tried to consider the absolute breadth of the situation, it just doesn't compute, or at least it doesn't compute for me. And I think the similar thing when we started to have these conversations about Black Lives Matter, about racism, where if you actually start to engage this, the actual topic and the actual conversation is so large that you can only ever really address it through the personal, or through one particular industry, or through one particular country, or one particular kind of circumstance. Because once you start unpacking these, kind of unraveling the thread, there are like so many other threads beneath it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking a lot about kind of scales of problems and how we can kind of, what is the most meaningful way of having these conversations, and what is the most meaningful way of entering into those conversations, doing that in grounding it in personal experiences, in grounding it in communities, because the actual thing is so big that I don't think any of us have the capacity to actually fully comprehend, and I don't think it's useful, if that makes sense. So I don't know if that's a revelation. It's just something that I've kind of been like thinking about a lot, is like scales of problems and how we kind of effectively talk about them.
And Hannah, what about yourself? Anything that's been a revelation or a reflection for you in 2020?
Well, I think 2020 has been a year where we've all been stuck inside, and also even when we're communicating with the world, we're just on Zoom looking at our own faces. That I realised how quickly we become narcissists, but also actually just having to deal with such change in the world all on our own. I've realized how much we need each other, and how much we need to actually just be in conversation, and how much I've missed that, just the free flowing conversations. And though before lockdown, I was really longing for some sort of quiet, reflective time, I've had enough of that now. And I don't like banana bread. I really want to get out the house, and I miss being in the pub. Those are my revelations. So there
isn't a play around banana bread and the pub then?
No, you're not going to get that from me. You might get one about being in the pub, but definitely not banana bread. It is horrendous and terrible.
Is there anything you would like to say to our audience today about this event itself, and why discussions like this need to be had?
Sidney, or should I go?
Oh, sorry, I should know what I'm doing by now, right? Hannah, sorry, go ahead.
I just think these are wonderful discussions. I mean, especially it's actually, I think it's the first time I've ever been asked to speak out with Scotland, so that's been quite nice. So I thought I'd just throw the word "out with" in there as a very Scottish word, just because we don't have. So that's been quite lovely, and I think it's been. I think they are really important, and a huge kudos to Sophie for setting this up and actually making me think about that question about ancestors and past, and how it nurtures and supports us. So yeah, I think these conversations are really important, and I hope we get to have more of them. I want to just throw in really quickly that I was born in Leicester. I don't know if that helps me with the local crowd. I just thought I'd throw that one in there. But yeah, no, I think these are really important. So huge well done, Sophie, for setting this up.
And what about yourself, Sidney?
Yeah, similarly, I'm going to also use the word "out with" because this is the first time I've been asked to talk out with my own house. So I'm excited to be on the panel and to have these discussions. And huge thank you to Sophie. It's also just great to, like you said, to build these kind of connections, and to, like, I didn't know Hannah before this. It's great to chat with you and to learn more about your work, and to learn more about your kind of artistic journey and the stuff that you've been creating, definitely. And yeah, huge, massive kudos to Sophie. And I'm excited to see what other people say over the course of the week as well.
Definitely. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been an honor to be in your presence, lady. You've really inspired me, and I'm just blown away by your artistic creative presence and the work that you are doing and you are going to continue to do. I'm going to go back to Sophie, and if Sophie is there, I believe we're going to have, there's some Q&As, questions that the audience may possibly like to ask, or if there's anything Sophie would like to share with us. Sophie, are you
I'm here.
available?
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. Guys, it's been such a pleasure to hear you all speak about your work and get this opportunity to share, you know, with each other just what we're all doing and who you are, and get to know each other and build these connections. I think it's that's one benefit of Zoom, I guess, over this time, that we've got to reach out to each other even though we're like on the other sides of the country. So yeah, if anybody wants to ask a question or pop something in chat, or if you want to use the little reaction button at the bottom to raise your hand and then ask one, absolutely feel free to do that now. I had someone just now ask me if the session is being recorded, because they'd like to watch it back another time. So definitely, if you follow Revoluton Arts, which is the funders that have helped us to make this happen, and also my social media, which is S Gresswell Art or Sophie Gresswell Artist on Facebook, I'll be posting up, because it's being recorded, sessions of the chats. So anyone who hasn't been able to join us can watch them back, hopefully. We have a question from Ray Lever. Lovely, Ray. What are the panelists' greatest hopes for next year, the next 5 years in theatre and performing arts? Is there a particular story that they would love to explore? Who would like to field that one first? Sidney, go on. I can see.
Big question. I think it's hard to go past the immediate. Like, my greatest hope for next year is that we work a bit more than this year, which is not a great answer to the question. I think over the next, I would like to see more community-based stories and community-based work, and work that prioritizes certain voices on bigger stages and in bigger. And when I say on bigger stages, I mean kind of as a central focus of the place. I think oftentimes we have the kind of like, a theatre might do a community production and it's like 4 days and the rest of the time is like kind of regular, what we would call like regular theatre, like professional theatre. And I would love to see kind of those kind of community stories being more at the heart of what people are thinking about when they're thinking about theatre, and thinking about the kind of community investment in storytelling and community investment in the ways that we create our stories and the ways that we engage people with our stories being more of a central focus in how we're creating work, and not just thinking about, okay, how can we get certain professional artists in, but also how can we meaningfully create the dialogue around the work that we're creating, and how can we meaningfully create work that is serving its community, not just representing its community, if that makes sense. Yeah. And then the second part of the question, I don't know if Hannah wants to answer the first part.
Yeah, let's break it down, because I can never remember the whole question. So
okay. Sydney, I hope there's more work going around. That's a hope for that. I suppose my biggest hope also probably reflects my biggest worry, is that I hope in sort of post-Brexit and obviously the kind of COVID, that theatre, especially in my country, I'm not, you know, I don't know England as well, but hopefully in my country theatre will still be international, and that we will still have international touring, and we'll still be inspired by theatre and artists from across the world, and that we won't become more and more insular. And that's my biggest worry, I think. And my hope is that we still have an international outlook in my country to theatre and to the arts. Yeah, so that's the first part of the question, Sidney. I can quickly go to the last part of the question. My last part of the question is particular stories. I suppose as I'm getting older, I just want to have, I want to see more stories, and so suppose I will write more about women as they get older, and about female friendships, and women as kind of intellectual, curious human beings, and not always just kind of in relation to, or, you know, or obsessed by their love lives. I want stories about women, yeah, and older women. So there you go. That's me answered all the questions, Sidney, so you can have it all.
Yeah, I'm really trying to think of like a story that I would love. I would love to write. I would love to write a more kind of size diversity in my work, and have more of a priority on. I would love to write a story with like a fat woman protagonist. I think that's something I haven't done, and I would love to do. And I don't know what that would be. I imagine it. I imagine it would be some kind of romance, because I feel like a fat woman-led romance is something that I would love to do. But yeah, that's kind of my initial gut response to that question of like, that's what I would like to do. But yeah.
I am looking in to see that in advance, Sidney. So yes, please. I've got one from Lizzie Fritwell. How do you approach storytelling and writing about something which you've not directly or personally experienced?
Shall I go for that one? I think I approach it the same. I mean, I think as writers, I resent sometimes the way in which, especially women of colour, we get kind of told that we only ever tell stories, that our stories are so rooted in ourselves that we have no imagination or capacity for imagination. And so for me, I think for whatever I write about, when I wrote The Lament for Sheikh Ubaya, which wasn't about me, it was about, I suppose it's always an act of imagination. And so in some ways, every writer always writes from where they stand, but it's imagining from where you stand. So I think it's just this, it's just imagination, and it just, and sometimes there's a lot of research too, actually, but it's a kind of immersing yourself in whether you do that through research or, you know, taking a walk where your character might have walked, but it's all just about imagination. So I think it's just, it's that thing of being a writer, so that you kind of imagine yourself into other people's shoes. Yeah, Sidney.
Yeah, I think it's the same. I think oftentimes it is like you say, like finding where you relate at whatever point that is. So it might be the tiniest part of the story, the tiniest point of the story, but making sure that you're really connected at that point, and allowing yourself to kind of use that as your jumping off point for your empathy, and using that to go. Like, as I was kind of talking about Wicks, like I've thankfully never experienced what the characters in that show experienced, but I have experienced grief, and I have experienced friendship being affected by that, and that being my starting point allowed me to then always know I had that emotional run through, and I could then go, okay, I can empathize and work my way outwards from that point, because I've got a really solid base that I know I will always return to, that kind of connection within the story.
Well, I've got one really good tip, actually, Sidney, I'll share with you. If I have to write about a character that I really don't know, I make them a soundtrack, and then I make like a Spotify list that I just listen to obsessively, and suddenly I know exactly how that person thinks. Just saying. So that's a really good one. So that person like Justin Bieber, like that's, yeah, you know.
So I'm notorious for having like one song, and like my Spotify Wrapped is just like a song that I listened to 50 times over the course of 3 days when I was writing a character, and it's not genuinely a song I actually like. Creating, like, having those ways about having places to go, having stories, definitely.
Amazing. I have a little comment. Helen Colony, thank you so much for this wonderful event. Being Scottish, has been great to hear the word outwit twice. Both your plays are so important to hear. She works at the university here in Luton, and would be great to include them both in our curriculum in the social studies department. Both such important pieces of work. Would this be possible? So I think that's a conversation that you probably should have, Helen, with Sidney and Hannah. So if you send me privately your email, your details, then I'll pass that on to the guys here, and you can have a conversation. Amazing. So I'll just wait one more second or two, see if anyone else pops up with a question, but I think we've overrun a little bit, so I will wrap up if nobody else pops in a question in the next few secs. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for attending today, and I just want to say a quick thank you to our funders, Arts Council England, and supporter Revoluton Arts today. Thank you so much to the lovely ladies that have been here tonight. Shemiza Rashid, thank you so much for hosting and being a wonderful host and asking all these important questions, and just making everything flow and everyone feel so comfortable. Thank you for that. Hannah, thank you so much for coming along and sharing your perspective and your stories, and I look forward to seeing more of your work soon. And same to you, Sidney. I can't wait to see, well, hopefully both of you in real life sometime. That would be wonderful. If I actually got to meet with you all. And yeah, everyone's saying on the chat how inspiring the conversation was and how much they've enjoyed it. And it's been lovely to host this space with you all tonight. I'm going to remind you and plug all the next two talks that we've got lined up. So on Wednesday, we've got lovely Maureen Grillo, art therapist and artist in her own right. And we've got Afia Campbell, who's a performer and singer and theatre maker as well. And on Thursday, I'll be sharing some work relating to my ancestry and looking at St Helena, Little British Overseas Territory, but how that links to my experience in Britain and my grandfather's experience growing up in St Helena, and a discovery of a mass grave of liberated African enslaved people there. And also I'll be joined by activist Peggy King-George and filmmakers Joseph Corrin and Dominic Devere. So if anyone wants to join me there, the event links are on the Revoluton Arts page, but they're also on my social media, which I've been spreading about for this event. So yeah, and you can just leave a message for me in the chat, or you can go on to @SGresswellArt and yeah, just get in touch, and I hope to see you guys there. Thank you all so much, yeah, and do join us again for the next talks. Take care.